My wife and I have been married for 7 years. We don't have kids, it was a mutual decision. Things were fine, or so I thought. We had a rhythm. She worked as an event planner, always bustling around the city, and I worked remotely in IT, which gave me plenty of time to handle the house and support her hectic schedule. I thought we were solid. But I guess love can make you blind, or maybe just naive. Her work required her to take a lot of rides around town. At first, it was different drivers every time. Then about 6 months ago, she mentioned how great it was to have found a regular Uber driver, Chris. She told me he was friendly and reliable and would wait for her during events instead of leaving her stranded like some drivers. I didn't think anything of it. She'd come home and casually mention his name in passing. Chris was so helpful today, or Chris said this funny thing. Honestly, it didn't bother me. I was just glad she was safe. But looking back now, the signs were there. She started dressing a little differently, more makeup, tighter dresses, saying it was for work. Then came the late nights. She used to text me updates if an event ran long, but suddenly, she was too busy to even send a quick message. When I'd ask about it, she'd wave it off, claiming I was being paranoid or controlling. The gaslighting, I now realize, had already begun. A few weeks ago, she asked if I could take a short business trip to unwind since I'd been working hard. It struck me as odd because I rarely traveled for work. She insisted, even helped pack my bag, kissing me sweetly on the cheek as I left. That was the first time I had a gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. But I still ignored it. Then, last night, it all came crashing down. I came back from my business trip a day earlier than planned. My flight landed late, and I was exhausted. All I wanted was to collapse into bed and maybe surprise my wife with a quiet breakfast the next morning. But when I got to our building, something felt off. Her car wasn't in the driveway, which wasn't unusual for her late-night events, but the living room lights were on. It was 1 a.m. I went inside and found nothing out of the ordinary. The house was quiet. I texted her, asking where she was, but she didn't reply. That was when my instincts kicked in. I checked the Find My app we'd both shared for years, and her location popped up somewhere about 15 minutes away. My stomach churned as I realized it wasn't a work venue or anywhere familiar. It was a parking lot. Grabbing my keys, I drove to the spot. I felt like a madman, heart racing, palms sweaty, the whole 9 yards. When I pulled up, the lot was mostly empty, except for a few cars under dimly lit street lamps. And there it was, a black sedan with fogged-up windows. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself I'd made a mistake. But as I got closer, I saw her in the back seat with him. I froze, paralyzed by the scene unfolding before me. They weren't just talking. My wife was straddling the driver, her head thrown back, lost in the moment. It was raw, primal, disgusting. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, the rage inside me took over. I banged on the window, and they both jumped like guilty teenagers. The look on her face when she saw me was priceless, pure terror. "Get out," I said through gritted teeth. Chris scrambled to adjust himself, mumbling something about it not being what it looked like. She, on the other hand, had the audacity to scream at me for sneaking up on her and embarrassing her. Embarrassing her? The gall of it. I laughed bitterly and walked away, refusing to let them see me lose control. My phone buzzed nonstop as I drove home, calls, texts, frantic voice messages from her. I ignored them all. When she finally came home about an hour later, she immediately launched into hysterics. Crying, yelling, blaming me. It was a mistake. You drove me to this with how distant you've been. I didn't mean for you to find out like this. The lies poured out like a broken faucet. When I told her I was filing for divorce, she laughed in my face. You won't, she sneered. You love me too much. She was wrong. The morning after I caught her, she was already in full damage control mode. She acted like nothing happened, brewing coffee and making breakfast as if I hadn't just seen her with another man. When I told her again that I was filing for divorce, she laughed it off. Let's not make rash decisions, okay? You don't want to be the guy who ruins a perfectly good marriage over one little mistake. Perfectly good marriage? I couldn't even comprehend the delusion. I went upstairs, locked myself in the office, and started looking up divorce lawyers. I wasn't playing her game. That's when a wild thought hit me. I needed evidence. Something more than my word against hers, something solid. And if I was going to fight for everything I'd worked so hard to build, I had to do it smartly. Enter the unexpected ally. In the chaos of the last 24 hours, I'd remembered something my wife once casually mentioned. Her Uber driver Chris was married too. I found him on social media and started digging. It didn't take long to find his wife's profile. Let's call her Jessica. She worked as a private investigator. Seriously, you can't make this up. I sent her a message, explaining who I was and what had happened. To my surprise, she responded almost immediately. She wasn't shocked. Turns out, she'd been suspicious of her husband for a while but hadn't been able to prove anything. We decided to meet in person. Jessica brought years of experience and tools I'd never even considered. She offered to help gather irrefutable evidence, not just for me but for her own divorce case. It felt strange teaming up with someone whose life had been wrecked by the same two people, but it also gave me clarity. If we were going down, we weren't going alone. Over the next week, Jessica went full PI mode. She tracked Chris's movements, found his burner phone, and uncovered a treasure trove of texts, photos, and even videos of their encounters, most of them taken in his car. She found receipts for fancy dinners, hotel rooms, and even a spa day my wife had told me was a work retreat. The final nail in the coffin? A video of them laughing in his car, mocking me. My wife called me boring and clueless, while Chris suggested they keep using me for money until she figured things out. I felt humiliated, furious, and strangely liberated. I had everything I needed. Jessica and I devised a plan. We'd expose them publicly. Not out of pettiness, but to strip away the lies they'd built around us. Friends, family, colleagues, they deserved to know the truth. The first step was to confront them together. Jessica and I agreed to confront them publicly. She arranged for us to meet at a neutral location, a quiet park near Chris's usual pickup area. She made it clear we'd be doing this her way, which meant cameras rolling and no room for lies. I texted my wife, telling her we needed to talk. She responded immediately, saying she was glad I was finally being reasonable. Jessica, meanwhile, had messaged Chris, baiting him with a fake story about needing help after a car breakdown. Both of them agreed to meet at the same time, completely unaware of what was coming. When my wife arrived, her fake concern nearly sent me over the edge. "I'm glad you're ready to fix this," she said, trying to reach for my hand. I pulled away and simply said, "Wait here." Chris showed up a few minutes later, looking smug as ever. The moment he saw Jessica, his face fell. "What's going on?" he stammered. My wife turned pale as realization dawned. "We know," Jessica said, her voice steady and cold. "About the late-night rides, the hotels, the back seat. Everything." The next few minutes were chaos. My wife immediately launched into defensive mode, pointing at me and screaming, "You set this up? You're insane." Chris tried to act calm, but Jessica wasn't having it. She pulled out printed copies of their texts and photos, throwing them at him like confetti. "Stop lying, Chris," she said. "We have proof. The only question is how far we want to take this." My wife, still trying to salvage the situation, turned to me. "This is between us. You didn't have to involve her. You're making this worse for no reason." I finally snapped. "You made it worse the moment you decided screwing your driver was worth destroying our marriage. This is on you." Her response? Pure venom. You're pathetic. You've always been boring, and maybe if you'd paid attention to me, this wouldn't have happened. Jessica, who had been silent up to this point, laughed. Wow. Blame him? Classic cheater playbook. Then she turned to Chris and added, "Don't bother coming home. You'll be hearing from my lawyer." My wife broke down, crying and screaming about how unfair this was. But I was done. I left her there with Chris, both of them scrambling to make sense of the wreckage they'd caused. Jessica and I didn't stop there. Armed with the evidence, she helped me send everything to my divorce lawyer, ensuring there was no wiggle room for lies in court. We also shared the truth with mutual friends and family. The reactions were a mix of shock, anger, and disgust. And that was just the beginning. The aftermath was brutal, but necessary. Jessica and I made it clear to our cheating spouses that their web of lies wouldn't just dissolve quietly. We were going to hold them accountable, not only in court but in their social circles as well. First, the evidence. Jessica, being a pro at this, sent every damning text, photo, and video to our respective divorce lawyers. My lawyer was floored by the sheer amount of proof we had. "This is a slam dunk," he told me, "especially with the infidelity clause in your prenup." That was the first good news I'd heard in weeks. My wife wouldn't just lose me, she'd lose the financial cushion she'd been counting on. But that wasn't all. Jessica had a brilliant idea: let's control the narrative. If there's one thing cheaters hate more than being caught, it's being exposed. Together, we compiled everything into a detailed timeline, sparing no detail, and shared it with our closest friends and family. It wasn't out of spite, it was about transparency. We wanted people to know the truth before the cheaters could spin their own versions of the story. The reactions? Explosive. My wife's family was horrified. Her parents called me to apologize for her behavior, which was ironic because they'd always doted on her and treated me like an afterthought. "We didn't raise her to be like this," her father said, clearly embarrassed. Meanwhile, her friends, especially the ones she'd bragged to about her work husband, dropped her like a bad habit. As for Chris, well, Jessica made sure his world came crashing down too. His boss at the rideshare company was sent the evidence of him using the vehicle for extracurricular activities. He was promptly fired. Jessica also shared everything with his family, including the receipts for gifts he'd bought my wife while claiming to be broke at home. His wife's PI skills ensured he didn't have a single leg to stand on. But the most satisfying part? The public confrontation. Jessica and I planned it carefully, timing it to coincide with Chris's usual hangout at a local bar. We walked in together, handed him and my wife envelopes filled with printed evidence, and loudly declared, "This is for ruining our lives." Then we walked out, leaving them to deal with the fallout in front of their friends. My wife moved out shortly after. She had the nerve to accuse me of ruining her life as she packed her things. I just smiled and said, "You did that all by yourself." Once the dust settled, the legal proceedings began. Armed with the overwhelming evidence Jessica and I had collected, I felt confident. My lawyer assured me that the prenup, specifically its infidelity clause, would strip my wife of any claim to my savings, a house, or alimony. It was poetic justice. The divorce filings hit her like a freight train. She tried to play the victim, accusing me of being cruel and vindictive. In her response, she claimed the affair was a symptom of our failing marriage and blamed me for neglecting her needs. The audacity of it all almost made me laugh. Almost. Jessica's divorce case was even messier. Chris, being the fool he was, tried to argue that the affair wasn't serious and shouldn't impact their settlement. Jessica's lawyer obliterated him in court, using a combination of the evidence we gathered and Chris's own text messages boasting about how free he felt with my wife. The real kicker? Chris and my wife both tried to deny some of the evidence, claiming it had been doctored or misinterpreted. That blew up in their faces when my lawyer subpoenaed Chris's financial records, which matched the receipts Jessica had dug up. At one point, Chris actually muttered, "This is bullshit," in court. The judge wasn't impressed. The court's rulings were swift and merciless. My wife walked away with nothing but her personal belongings. The house stayed mine, my savings untouched, and any chance of spousal support completely off the table. Jessica's case wasn't far behind. Chris was ordered to pay her a hefty settlement and relinquish joint assets. It was a total rout. Despite their losses, my wife and Chris didn't disappear quietly. My wife started spreading rumors about how I'd been controlling and how the affair wasn't really an affair. Chris, meanwhile, went on a social media tirade, calling Jessica a cold-hearted bitch. Their desperation only made their lies more transparent. Jessica and I stayed in touch throughout it all. The bond we'd formed in the chaos of our mutual betrayals felt unbreakable. We weren't romantic, we were partners in rebuilding our lives. She called it revenge therapy, and honestly, it worked. Every step of the legal process felt like reclaiming a piece of ourselves that they had tried to steal. But while the legal battles were over, the real challenge was starting fresh. Once the court rulings were finalized, I was officially free, on paper, at least. Emotionally, I was still reeling. The betrayal left a wound that didn't seem to heal, no matter how much justice had been served. Jessica felt the same way. We often talked about how strange it was to win a battle but still feel the weight of the war. Life after the divorce was a slow climb. The first thing I did was renovate the house. It wasn't just about changing the walls or furniture, it was about reclaiming the space, making it mine again. I tore down anything that reminded me of her and started fresh. It felt cathartic, even liberating. Jessica threw herself into her work as a private investigator. She said that digging into other people's lies was oddly therapeutic. It reminded her that she wasn't the only one who'd been betrayed. We'd meet up every so often to catch up and share updates. She'd always have some outrageous new story about a case, and I'd fill her in on how I was learning to enjoy being alone. As for my ex-wife, she tried reaching out a few times. The first message came just a week after the divorce was finalized. It was a classic let's talk text, filled with vague apologies and a not-so-subtle request for a second chance. I ignored it. Then came the phone calls, which I blocked. Eventually, she sent a long email, dripping with self-pity and attempts to rewrite history. "You were distant," she wrote. "You didn't make me feel wanted. I made a mistake, but we can fix this." Fix it? There was nothing left to fix. I didn't respond. That email went straight to the trash. Chris wasn't faring much better. Word got around that he was living out of his car for a while. Jessica later told me that his family had cut him off after the affair came to light, and his friends weren't exactly rushing to his defense either. Karma had hit him hard, and I couldn't muster any sympathy. But the most surprising development came months later when Jessica called me with some news. "You're not going to believe this," she said, barely able to contain her laughter. "Your ex and Chris moved in together." I couldn't stop laughing. It was too perfect. Two people who'd built their relationship on lies now stuck with each other in the rubble. Jessica and I joked about how long they'd last before tearing each other apart. In the meantime, I focused on moving forward. I started traveling more, something I hadn't done much of during my marriage. I went hiking in national parks, spent weekends by the coast, and even took a solo trip abroad. Being alone wasn't as scary as I thought. It was freeing. I could rediscover who I was without the shadow of betrayal hanging over me. Jessica and I stayed in touch, though less frequently as we both moved on. She threw herself into her work, while I slowly started opening myself up to the idea of dating again. It wasn't easy. Trust felt like a fragile, foreign concept, but I was determined not to let the past define my future. One day, Jessica texted me out of the blue, "I've got an idea. Let's toast to our freedom, one last hurrah." And that's exactly what we did. Jessica's idea of a hurrah was anything but ordinary. She booked us a weekend trip to a vineyard she'd always wanted to visit. "It's not a date," she clarified with a laugh when I hesitated, just two comrades celebrating a victory. And honestly, after everything we'd been through, it sounded like a perfect way to mark the end of a long, painful chapter. When we arrived, the scenery felt like something out of a movie. Rolling hills, endless rows of grapevines, and a sunset that painted the sky in hues of orange and pink. It was serene, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past months. Over the weekend, we drank too much wine, swapped stories about our healing journeys, and even laughed about the absurdity of our ex's situation. Jessica had heard through the grapevine, pun intended, that Chris and my ex-wife were already on rocky terms. Apparently, two cheaters don't make a happy couple, she said, grinning. As the sun set on the final evening, we found ourselves sitting on the veranda, sharing a bottle of the vineyard's best red. Jessica raised her glass. To freedom, she said. To survival, I added, clinking my glass against hers. There was a comfortable silence as we both stared out at the horizon. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. No anger, no bitterness. Just a quiet acceptance of what had happened and an openness to whatever was coming next. Jessica broke the silence. You know, she said, swirling her wine, this whole mess, it didn't just teach me about betrayal. It taught me how strong I am. How strong we both are. She was right. If you'd asked me a year ago if I could survive something like this, I would have said no. But here I was, standing taller than ever. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. As the weekend ended, Jessica and I parted ways, both ready to fully embrace our new beginnings. It wasn't goodbye, just a pause as we each stepped into our next chapters. Back home, I started dating again. Slowly, cautiously. Each step forward felt like a small victory. And while I wasn't in a rush to find the one, I felt a renewed sense of hope. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was enough. As for my ex-wife and Chris? The last I heard, they'd broken up in a spectacularly messy fashion. Mutual friends reported that my ex had accused Chris of cheating on her again. Apparently, their bond wasn't as unshakable as they'd thought. It was the final bit of closure I needed, a reminder that their betrayal was never about me. It was about them and their flaws. Jessica texted me a few months later, ran into Chris at the grocery store. He looked like he'd aged 10 years. You're winning. I smiled, knowing she was right. After that weekend at the vineyard, life felt lighter. I wasn't constantly replaying the betrayal or living with the weight of what had happened. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was focusing on what I wanted, something I hadn't done in years. Redefining happiness turned out to be less about grand gestures and more about the small things. I started trying new hobbies, things my ex would have rolled her eyes at. I joined a hiking group, took up photography, and even signed up for a cooking class, where, to my surprise, I wasn't half bad. Each little venture felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that I hadn't realized I'd lost. Jessica and I stayed in touch, though less frequently as we both poured ourselves into rebuilding our lives. She took on bigger, more challenging cases, often texting me wild updates about the ridiculous things people do when they think no one's watching. You wouldn't believe the guy I'm tailing right now, she once wrote. Wearing a wig to cheat. A wig. I laughed out loud at her texts, grateful for the bond we'd formed through the chaos. While I didn't see her as a romantic interest, she was a reminder of how far I'd come. We'd both climbed out of the wreckage and were thriving in our own ways. Meanwhile, I cautiously dipped my toes into the dating pool. It wasn't easy. Trust was still a tender spot, and I found myself second-guessing every interaction. But I pushed forward, determined not to let the past define my future. Most dates were fine, a few were great, and one or two were downright disasters. But each experience taught me something about myself, what I wanted, what I valued, and, most importantly, what I wouldn't tolerate. One day, during a routine grocery run, I ran into an old friend I hadn't seen in years. She was someone I'd known in college, kind, funny, with a sharp wit that always kept me on my toes. We struck up a conversation that lasted far longer than I'd expected, and before I knew it, I was leaving with her number. We started hanging out, casually at first, coffee here, a walk there. But over time, it turned into something more. She was patient with me, understanding when I opened up about my past, and refreshingly honest about her own. For the first time since my marriage ended, I felt like I could trust someone without constantly looking for red flags. Jessica, ever the cheerleader, was thrilled when I told her about the budding relationship. "You deserve this," she texted. "Just remember, no matter what, you're whole on your own. Anyone who adds to that is just a bonus." Her words stuck with me. For so long, I'd felt like my happiness depended on someone else, first my wife, then my healing. But now, I realized happiness was something I could create for myself, regardless of anyone else. As my relationship grew, so did my sense of purpose. I started volunteering at a local nonprofit, helping people navigate tough transitions in their lives. It felt good to give back, to use my own experience to help others rebuild. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And that was enough. My life, once tangled in betrayal and heartbreak, was finally taking a shape that felt entirely mine. The relationship I was building with my old college friend, let's call her Emily, grew steadily. She wasn't just kind and understanding, she had this rare ability to make me laugh even on my worst days. For the first time, I felt like I didn't have to wear any armor. With her, I could just be. Jessica, of course, stayed in the loop. She had this uncanny way of swooping into my life with her witty one-liners and relentless positivity. One day, she called out of the blue. "So, when am I meeting Emily?" she asked. I laughed. "Why? You planning to interrogate her like you're on a case?" "Damn right I am," she said, dead serious. "I need to make sure you're not walking into another mess. Think of me as your unofficial screening committee." Despite her tough talk, the meeting went surprisingly well. Jessica and Emily hit it off almost instantly. Watching them banter over coffee was surreal. It felt like two very different parts of my life coming together seamlessly. By the end of it, Jessica leaned over to me and whispered, "She's a keeper. Don't screw this up." With Emily's gentle encouragement, I started to fully embrace my new beginning. I let go of the last remnants of my anger toward my ex-wife. It wasn't forgiveness, it was just a quiet acceptance that holding on to that bitterness only kept me tethered to the past. And the past had no place in my future. Emily and I began making plans together, not just for weekends or vacations, but for a life. It was scary, sure, but also exhilarating. Every step forward felt like uncharted territory, a fresh page in a story that was finally my own. Meanwhile, Jessica had her own exciting news. She was opening her own private investigation firm, something she'd dreamed of for years. "If you ever need me to vet someone, you know where to find me," she joked during one of our catch-up calls. "You're not going to have to vet anyone," I said. "I think I've got it right this time." Life wasn't perfect, but it was full. Full of laughter, hope, and the quiet joy of knowing I'd survived the worst and come out stronger. And as I stood at the edge of this new chapter, I realized something profound: betrayal doesn't define you. Healing does. And healing? That's something I could finally say I'd achieved. A year after the dust had fully settled, life had transformed into something I didn't just tolerate, I cherished it. Emily and I had moved in together, a milestone I hadn't rushed into but felt completely right when the time came. We'd created a home that was warm, welcoming, and brimming with the kind of quiet intimacy I hadn't realized I was missing before. Jessica's private investigation firm was thriving, and she often joked about how her side hustle of helping me had been the best advertising she could have asked for. "Turns out, revenge stories make for great client referrals," she said during one of our monthly dinner catch-ups. It became a ritual: Emily, Jessica, and I meeting over good food, wine, and endless laughter. The three of us had formed an odd but deeply supportive little family. One evening, Jessica showed up to dinner with a bottle of champagne and a mischievous grin. "You're never going to believe who got arrested," she said, popping the cork dramatically. Emily and I exchanged glances, intrigued. "Chris?" I guessed, only half joking. "Bingo," Jessica said, practically giddy. Turns out, our favorite rideshare Casanova was scamming clients on the side. Fraud, embezzlement, the whole 9 yards. He's looking at serious jail time. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. "And my ex?" I asked. "Still playing Bonnie to his Clyde?" Jessica shrugged. "Who knows? But if karma's anything to go by, she's not exactly thriving." It was strange how little I cared. A year ago, news like this would have consumed me. But now? It was just a footnote in a story I'd long since closed the book on. That night, as we clinked glasses, Jessica raised her champagne flute high. "To reinvention," she said. "To getting the last laugh." Emily smiled and added, "and to building something better." I chimed in, "To freedom and to knowing our worth." The toast hung in the air like a promise, and as we drank, I realized something. I wasn't just celebrating survival or even recovery. I was celebrating a future I'd fought hard to create, a future where I was surrounded by people who truly cared, where I'd learned to trust again, and where happiness wasn't something I was chasing but something I was living. As the evening wound down, Emily slipped her hand into mine. "Do you ever think about how far you've come?" she asked softly. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But mostly, I think about where I'm going. And for the first time in a long time, I'm excited about it." The truth was, I had no idea what the future held. But for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare me. It thrilled me. If you had told me 2 years ago that my life would look like this, I would have laughed in disbelief. But here I was, standing on the other side of chaos, stronger, wiser, and, most importantly, happier. Emily and I spent the following months building a life filled with small, meaningful joys, lazy Sundays in the garden, spontaneous road trips, and quiet nights watching movies. There was no drama, no emotional landmines, just the kind of partnership I'd always imagined but never truly believed was possible. Jessica, ever the whirlwind of energy, continued thriving. Her private investigation firm had become one of the most sought after in the city, and she was even mentoring others in the field. She joked that my betrayal had been her big break. Every time she said it, we'd both laugh, marveling at the strange ways life had unfolded. As for my ex-wife and Chris, their stories faded into the background, like old news you no longer care to read. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that they were no longer together, their relationship imploding under the weight of their own deceit. It was fitting, in a way, but by then, I didn't feel anything about it, not anger, not satisfaction, just indifference. The real closure came on a crisp autumn evening, about a year and a half after everything had unraveled. Emily and I were hosting a small dinner party, a mix of friends, family, and a certain private investigator who had become like a sister to me. As the night wound down, I stepped outside to take in the cool air and the sound of laughter spilling from the house. Jessica joined me, her glass of wine in hand. "You did it, you know," she said, leaning against the railing. "Did what?" I asked, curious. "You built a new life. One that's yours. No compromises, no half measures. It's inspiring." I smiled, feeling the truth of her words settle in my chest. "I couldn't have done it without you," I admitted. "You gave me the tools to fight back when I didn't think I could." She waved me off with a grin. "Please, I just gave you the evidence. You did the hard part, walking away and not looking back." We stood there for a while, quietly reflecting on everything that had brought us to this moment. The pain, the betrayal, the unexpected bond we'd formed, it had all led to something better. Before heading back inside, I turned to her. "To think, it all started with a cheating Uber driver." Jessica laughed. "If that's not a headline for a movie, I don't know what is." That night, as I lay in bed next to Emily, her hand resting lightly on mine, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. Life wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But it was mine, filled with love, trust, and the promise of a future built on solid ground. And that was more than enough. Thank you for listening to my story. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think.